For this skills demonstration, we'll be looking at conditional processing. Specifically, I'd like to teach you how to use App Inventor to use relational operators to ask questions and if-then blocks to process the results. We're going to be working in the context of the hourly wages app that we discussed previously. Okay, so we wanted to explore the app for computing overtime pay or computing the hourly wages for an individual. So I'm going to sketch this out on paper first, just so we can get a sense of what the interface looks like. So I'm going to create a title up here, hourly wages. And the reason I'm doing this is it helps me to think about the kind of information I want to collect and how I'm going to process it. Right? So what does this app look like? Well, I probably need to collect what the individual's hourly rate is. So I'll have a text box for that. And then I also probably need to know the hours worked. And then, well, that's all the information I need for input, right? Yeah. And so now I have my calculate button. Calculate button. And what information do I want to display? Well, maybe I just want the total, but also I might be interested in particular in how much overtime they earned. So maybe I'll do this, overtime wages. And total wages. Okay. So again, I'm going to follow this same basic model that I followed in my previous session. I've got my input, I've got something that's going to trigger my processing, and I've got a place for my output. And now that I've thought about what I want for my input, my output, I need to think about how I'm going to do this kind of processing. And remember, as we said before, this is a conditional problem, right? So what? I want to compare my hours to 40. If my hours worked is greater than 40, then use overtime formula. Otherwise, I'm just going to multiply my rate times my hours. Right? So I can't do this in one step. I've got to ask this question specifically, how does my hours relate to 40? And depending upon the answer, I'm going to either use the overtime formula or I'm going to use the standard formula. Okay. I'm going to stop here for a second. What I'd like you to do is go off and practice creating this interface. This is something that's pretty straightforward for you now. But I'm not going to demonstrate how to do this. I'm not going to spend time with the video doing this. I'm going to just start up with my working version of this. But I wanted you to see how I got there. I always like to sketch out my interfaces first on paper, just so that I can really kind of think through what it is that I want to appear and how I'm going to approach this problem. Okay, so here's what I came up with for my interface. It looks pretty much like what we saw on our sketch. I embellished my header here a little bit. There's a couple of things I'd like to point out. Well, notice that I've got several components on my interface here. And over here we see I've named some of them but not others. In fact, my labels here, I left all of them unnamed. Now, previously, I gave you the guideline that if you have more than one, you should probably name it. I'm being a little bit lazy here, but this is a habit I've gotten myself into, and it seems to work for me. I try to recognize if there are components that I know that I'm going to manipulate in my program, I make sure I name those. But if there are things that I know that I'm just having on my screen that are not going to be manipulated, they're not going to change, I leave them alone. I leave them unlabeled. This tends to happen a lot with labels. I leave them unnamed, rather. So you'll notice that all my labels are just numerically numbered. Should I be doing that? Probably not, but we all get a little lazy sometimes. What I did name, though, was the things that I am going to be manipulating, namely my text boxes. And you should take note of this because since I let you create your own interface, you may have come up with different names. And so as we're working through this code example together, you want to be mindful of that your names may be different than mine. And so your code's going to be a little bit different. So just for clarity's sake, I named mine txt rate, txt hours, txt OT wages, and txt total wages. All right. There's one more thing I want to point out, and that is I'm using these text boxes here. These are input, and I want the user to be able to enter numbers into them. These text boxes down here are output. I don't want the user to actually be able to directly manipulate them. So one thing that I did was over here in my properties for these two is I set the enabled property. I unchecked it. Okay? If it's enabled, that means the user can interact with it. The way users interact with text boxes is they type text in. So since it's no longer checked, that means they're not able to enter text in there. If I go up here, we see hours worked, we see the check enabled is checked. That means we do allow them to enter some values in there. The other thing I did remember was I checked these two values as being numbers only because I only want the user to enter in numeric data in there, and I want my input fields to come up as, or my keyboard to come up as a keypad as opposed to a full alphanumeric keypad. Okay? So I think we're ready to go. So we want to go into the blocks editor and we want to add some code to power this. Now, one thing that I'm going to advise is that we actually work incrementally. So we know that we're going to multiply the hourly rate times the hours worked to get our total wages. But when the hours worked is greater than 40, we need to also account for overtime. But to get things started, let's just do that base case where I'm going to take my hourly rate, multiply it by my hours worked, and store it in my total wages. And I'm sure you can do that already without me. Why don't you go ahead and take a try at that? Okay, so what am I going to do? When my button is pushed, when my calc button is pushed, I want to set my total wages text to be the result of multiplying the rate times the hours. Okay, does that make sense? Let's take a look at that on our screen for a second and just verify that this works. I always like to do this sort of incremental development, to do small steps and then verify on the device that it is actually doing what I expect it to do. So let's take a look at our device for a second. Okay, so here we see it running on my phone. I'm going to type in an hourly rate. Let's see, $12.50. My hours worked 10. I'm going to press the calculate. And yeah, that's right, 125. Let's just confirm that. Times 5 should be 62.5. Oops. 62.5. Yep, there we go. All right. Looks good. Okay, so now I have a program that computes my hourly wages based on multiplying my rate of pay times my hours worked. This program doesn't take into account what happens when the individual in question has overtime pay coming to them. Right? So let's figure that out. What we wanted to do was we wanted to ask a question. Does this person qualify for overtime? What that means is we want to compare the hours that they worked to 40. We want to see if they've worked more than 40 hours. When they have, they qualify for overtime pay, and we calculate this total wages in a different way. All right. So to do that comparison, to ask that question, we're going to use the math drawer. And in here, this block is responsible for doing relational operators. This is right now comparing these two blocks and saying, are they the same? We could also ask, are they not the same? Is this one less than this one? Less than or equal to, greater than or greater than equal to? Right? So the things we wanted to compare were the hours that they worked, and we wanted to ask, is that greater than 40? Greater or greater than equal to? Well, if you work 40 hours, you don't get overtime, right? So it's strictly greater than 40. So the way this is constructed right now, this relational operator, it's asking a yes or no question. Depending upon what value is stored in this text box, will determine the outcome of this relationship. Right? If the hours stored is 45, 45 is greater than 40, so the answer is yes. If what's stored in the hours text box is 25, is 25 greater than 40? No. So this block will return no. Okay, so that's the way we ask the question of the data. Now what we want to do is we want to process that result. We want to take action depending upon what we found out. To do that, we're going to use the if-then block. And this is in the control drawer. If-then. Right? So if, and I put my question here, if it's the case that text hours is greater than 40, then what do I want to do? I want to compute total wages in a different way. I want to also set my overtime wages. Okay, so let's do that. So let's start with the overtime wages. So the overtime wages set that text property to what? Well, let's see, how does this work? If I've worked 48 hours, I've got 8 hours of overtime, which is time and a half of my regular base rate. Right? So what I need to do is I need to find out how many hours am I over by. To do that, I'm going to do some subtraction, right? I'm going to take the hours that I worked, I'm going to subtract 40. Right? So how many overtime hours do I have? And I want to multiply that by my rate times 1.5. Oh, I'm multiplying three numbers together. You know what I can do? I can just add another number into this multiplication field here, right? So number of hours of overtime times my rate times the literal value 1.5. Oops. Get in there. Times 1.5. There we go. There. So that sets my overtime wages. And now what? Now I need to set my total wages. What's my total wages? My total wages are going to be set my total wages. So total wages text to what? I want to add my overtime wages plus my regular full salary, right? So I want to add my overtime wages were, plus, what's my full salary? Well, it's 40 times my pay rate, right? My rate. So I get my base rate for the first 40 hours, plus time and a half for my overtime hours. There we go. Okay. Now, how does this fit in here? How does this fit into my whole big picture? Notice right now I've still got this if-then block. It's just kind of sitting out here. Nothing's happening with it. So what I want to do is, when the button's clicked, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to assume that you didn't have overtime. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to calculate your pay rate, your wages, by multiplying the rate times the hours. But if I come to find out that you actually earned overtime, then I will calculate the overtime and I'll reset that value. So I'm overwriting what was in there before. Let's see if this works. All right. So let's see, my hourly rate is going to be $10. My hours worked is going to be 40, and I calculate, and that should give me $400. Good. Now if I worked 41 hours, what should that give me? Well, I worked 1 hour of overtime, so I should get time and a half. So $10 plus half, so $15 times 1 hour. So $15 should be my overtime wages, and my total should now be $415. Well, that seemed to work. Good. And if I put in, say, 45, let's see, I should get $75 extra, right? Good. Perfect. Except there's one small problem. Can you detect what it is? What happens if I decide I get overtime, but then I decided to go back in here and change it so I work differently? What's it going to do? What's going to happen here? If I hit this calculate button, what do you think is going to happen? Let's see. Hours, 10 times 20 hours gives me wages of 200. No overtime. It got the total wages correct, but it didn't clear out that overtime wages. I should probably fix that, shouldn't I? How can I fix that? So let's go back in here into my blocks editor. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set the overtime wages. Set the overtime wages text here to 0. Right, so by default, I assume you get no overtime. But then I'll overwrite it and I'll change those values if I determine that you do, in fact, deserve overtime. Let's see if that works now. So now if I calculate, yeah, look at that. Okay, perfect.